All right, My Muscle Project, welcome back to another episode. This week, another physical therapist. We have Quinn, is it Henoch? Is that how I say the last name?
Yeah, that's pretty good.
All right, nice. It's the cheeky Australian accent getting away with it there. So Quinn, well, we first found out about Quinn because we were trying to figure out ways to improve our CrossFit team members' terrible overhead mobility. And we stumbled across probably one of the best, if not the best articles still about squat position and overhead mobility for your shoulders that you wrote for Juggernaut. And I mean, it was, back when you probably wrote that article, probably the only stuff you could find on that was like basically a band distracted overhead stretch with some like foam rolling for your back and maybe some rotator cuff exercises. But what really stood out to me in this article was how you were taking the squat and basically turning it onto the floor and getting you to like create the same positions but on the floor, and talked a lot about the breathing and the separation of the ribs and that having to do like the thoracic cage and having that being, the main thing contributing to limited overhead stuff. And that's really how we kind of got into the Juggernaut stuff and got into your stuff a lot as well. And I think it's for anyone that wants to understand like overhead position and squatting and stuff, that's probably one of the best articles on the internet that you wrote.
Very in-depth as well.
Yeah, it was very in-depth.
It's got to be long. Like, I don't know, 1,000 words or something, 13 videos.
A lot of videos, that sort of stuff. What I actually wanted to kind of start and open this up with was that's very unique. Not many people have done stuff like that before. And there's a lot of copycats in your sort of industry. A lot of people just kind of spinning the same stuff, but this was refreshing to get this kind of stuff. How did you end up down this path with maybe this article in particular? How did you was it your own creative juices? Did it have to do with teaming up with the Juggernaut guys? How did something like this come about?
Well, I think that, first of all, thank you. Nothing is original. So anything that I put out there, videos, articles, I'm stealing from other people too. So don't be fooled. But I think, Juggernaut Training Systems was certainly where I got my big break, so to speak, in regards to being able to have an audience and a platform to put content out for people to actually see. So I'm very, very grateful that I was able to link up with Juggernaut in that way. And I think my style or my philosophies, I try to be rooted in the actual scientific literature. And I think with my background as a physical therapist, we that's kind of pounded into our head, or at least it should be. So I'm able, I try to put a filter on. And so if I'm going to write an article like that, I try to think about keeping it as basic as possible, because I think that a lot of content that you're going to find on the internet is convoluted and focused on minutia that doesn't really matter and doesn't really change things in the long run. So I'm much more interested in motor skill acquisition, the science of motor control and motor skill acquisition, and the principles of tissue adaptation. So like, what actually changes tissue? What creates adaptation and the sufficient stressors that are needed for that? And so I think that is what keeps me grounded in simplicity. So I use my thought is like, what movement are we trying to improve upon, or the goal activity? And then what variations of that activity can we modify or implement to keep it as specific as possible? And if we have to keep going kind of down the rung of the ladder until we find a variation for the individual that they can practice, essentially, because that's all, that's what teaching somebody how to squat is, practice. It's just like shooting a free throw or hitting a baseball. It's the same type of deal. You just got to find the appropriate variation for them. And so within that, you've got range of motion, tempo, intensity, all these things that you can manipulate to try to get the person to be able to feel the positions. And so when you referenced in the article, some of those drills that I use where we get people in different positions, it's just a way for them to feel a certain aspect of the movement of the goal activity. And then the hope is that there's some carryover. We give them some type of lower level teaching drill, essentially, and then we try to integrate it within the movement itself, the squat, for example. So we'll give them a drill in between their warm-up sets or something like that to keep it specific, but also to get some integration there. And then, so you mentioned, things, the modalities such as static stretching, or all of the mobility, quote unquote, mobility implements that you'll see. And it's the foam roller, the bands, the lacrosse balls, all of it. It's all goes into the same bucket because we can't separate the mechanisms. There's no evidence to say they do anything different than each other. So you've got all that stuff. The issue with that stuff is the effects are sensory oriented, meaning they're short term. So it may change the way that you feel in a short instance, but that doesn't necessarily equate to tissue adaptation. And it certainly doesn't equate to you being able to practice the movement and acquire the skill of the movement because you're just flopping around on a foam roller. So you would have to still orient yourself to the movement itself. So my thought is, why not we just cut all the extra stuff that's not specific out, and then we can use movement to teach you movement, and you get the same effect, and you get the adaptation along with it.
How much do you feel like you can actually make a difference with to someone's just overall structure and tissue lengths and that sort of thing? Because I mean, it's always individual. I know that's obviously going to be the answer, but in your experience, can someone with very limited mobility create longer tissues? Can they create joints that move through a larger range of motion to a point where you could take them, a year, 2 years apart and be like, that's a whole different athlete. That moves a little bit different. There are small changes that we can make. We understand that, but usually from what I've seen, that athlete is still that athlete, and they still can't really lock their elbows out. They still can't really get their shoulders overhead. It's improved a little bit, but they still can't really touch their toes, despite making a pretty good attempt to work on it. What's your experience and thoughts?
It's a good question. I definitely think it depends on who we're talking about. I do see athletes make a 180, make just like a completely different person, but it's all about what they were working with. I think everybody thinks that their joints literally don't go into the positions that they want to, as in passively, but a lot of times they actually do. What they don't have is the motor skill for the movement itself. The overhead squat is a perfect example. There are many, many times that you'll look at somebody's overhead squat and they look like a baby giraffe, trying to hold a barbell over their head, barely squatting to half depth, elbows unlocked, all the stuff that you see. I was like, okay, that person needs more mobility. And what does that actually mean? Does that mean that their joints literally don't have the range of motion necessary for the tasks? Because what you'll find a lot of times is that if you lay them on the treatment table and I just passively move their joints around, they actually do possess adequate range of motion, or at least much more range of motion than they are demonstrating on their feet or under load or speed or fatigue or any other type of training quality that you can throw at them, stressor. So you got to establish that right off the bat. Do your joints not go into the positions, or do you not have the control to get to the joints into the positions? And so if you're the latter, where you actually do have the joints for the movement, you do see pretty dramatic changes in those types of people relatively quickly, because they just kind of learn how to control their body. And then all of a sudden they have new positions that they didn't think that was possible. Now, if you've got somebody on the other end of the spectrum whose elbows they have like a bony block at the end, boom, 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 you're not going to change that most likely. You're not going to get a crazy change there, maybe a few degrees necessarily. If it's a soft tissue thing, usually it's just a bone. This is their anatomy. It could be the same with the hips. Some people's hip joints are just built, such that they are not Gumby. It's the same with the ankles and the shoulders also to some extent. I think the shoulders are probably the joint that you can get the most change out of, just because of the architecture of the shoulder from a bony standpoint is like a golf ball sitting on a tee. There's not a whole lot of bony. It's not like the hip joint where you've got a ball and socket. And it's pretty ground into the joint. The shoulder is pretty mobile in general. So you can get some decent change there by just really tedious practice with different overhead variations and basically forcing the person to use their end range over and over. But my thought is very, very few joint limitations. Like if your joints don't have textbook range of motion, that doesn't necessarily preclude you from doing the movements that you want to do. You're just going to have to really, really hone in on where your end ranges are and try to get there as often as you can. And I always tell people, if that equates to an actual increase in your joint excursion, like your joints now literally have more range of motion than they did before, that's great. But at the minimum, you're going to at least be able to control your range of motion. Whatever range of motion that you possess, you'll have control of that, because most people don't. They'll say that their ankles don't move, and it looks like in their squat, their shins are completely vertical and they're not using their ankles at all. And you're like, oh yeah, you're right. But if you test them, their ankles have a little bit of dorsiflexion, like they're not fused, but they're not able to express even that limited range of motion. So again, it comes down to finding exercises and drills to get them to be able to feel new positions, and then just tedious practice. And I think people try to increase weight too soon. Intensity on the bar is the fastest way to dump somebody back into their old movement habits, because your body's going to freak out a little bit. Weight on the bar is a stressor. So if you've got an athlete who does some wonky things, it's very likely that they're going to do those things more when the weight's heavy. So if you can, I always call it like a technique threshold. If you can find the technique threshold in which positions start to break down, you want to kind of keep them there as long as you can. And you're just trying to brush that threshold just above it or just below it as often as you can to try to increase that so they can actually learn. But to answer, to your original question, I don't know to what extent tissues can lengthen, because there hasn't been a whole lot of longitudinal data on that. Like they'll take somebody who's has a certain range of motion, and they actually look like ultrasound image their tendon muscle pennation angle or something nerdy like that. And then they do a long-term intervention. Like 2 years later, they retest. There's nothing like that out there. I think that it probably does lengthen structurally, but I don't think it's like most of the stretching research shows no change. But those stretching protocols are usually like 6 to 8 weeks long, which it's not long-term in the grand scheme of things. If you look at athletes like gymnasts or martial artists who have been doing things for years, over a decade, and you see these crazy positions that they can get in, I would be willing to bet that they have some adaptive changes in their soft tissue that's probably different than a matched population who's not in that sport. But I would also say the structural changes probably don't equal the extent of the range of motion that they can get into, meaning increases in range of motion, and this is shown in the literature so far, from static stretching are due to your tolerance to the stretch. So your nervous system now becomes more tolerant to you stretching, and it allows you to get into those positions because you've been practicing them, you've been preparing. So it's just like training. Gymnasts are not only passively flexible, they can also hold those positions actively. They can do the splits in the air and hold their legs out there. Trained strength and control within those full ranges of motion, which is much different than just cranking somebody passively. I think that our muscles probably have the stretchy ability, like anybody can be Gumby, and just lay them on the table and put them under anesthesia. You can see that in a surgeon, any like YouTube surgeries, and surgeons are moving their limbs all around like a noodle. But as soon as they're awake, the nervous system kicks in and it protects you from going into those extreme ranges of motion because it doesn't think you can handle it because you've never been there. But if you train that, then I think there's changes. I think it's mostly neurological though, as opposed to structural.
Yeah. I've always found that it's much harder to train because I was doing some splits training for a while, to get permanent changes to the splits outside of the actual training. So when you're not warming up and when you're not doing it, you're not in the rep, it is quite hard to teach your body, like when it's cold, to, go to an increased range of motion for a long time. It didn't improve whatsoever that cold, but in the actual training, it got further because it felt like the nervous system was preparing itself. It was training in the same way that you couldn't like walk up and just bench 140, cold. It takes a few sets and reps to kind of warm up into it, to prime the nervous system to kind of go to the intensity. Same idea.
Well, you could. I think it's a matter of bringing up your minimums, because you could walk to the bench and bench 140 cold if you're good at bench press. Like a power, Chad Wesley Smith can walk up to 140 and bench it with one hand for a set of 60. So cold. So it all depends on your minimum. A gymnast can do the splits cold. They didn't used to be able to do that. I think the difference between a gymnast and you is that they stuck with it and they did it more often for longer and more intensely, regardless of how intense it felt like you were doing it in the moment. 5 or 10 minutes every day or here and there during the week is not enough. But beyond that, my question would be, why do you want to do the splits? And this is this is kind of rhetorical to you, but just down another rabbit hole is I think that there's this misconception that flexibility is somehow this gold standard of movement and injury prevention and injury risk reduction, and it's not. Range of motion is specific to the task. So being able to do the splits is not going to protect you from anything other than doing the splits. Injuries don't happen with somebody gently moving your joints passively into a range of motion and then you breathing and being able to hold. Injuries happen due to abrupt forces or repeated abrupt forces over time, either acute or chronic, but force nonetheless. So passive flexibility as a standalone quality is not protective of injury. Your tissues have to have the load capacity and tolerance to be able to absorb the forces going through those ranges of motion. It's like a fall. People will say, well, if you're flexible and you get stuck in the splits, then you're more protected. But it's not the fall, it's the abruptness of the change in position. Because if you fell in slow motion and went into the same position, you would probably be okay because your body would just melt into position like a stretch. But it's the abrupt change. So, and that's probably where you get more actual change in range of motion anyway. And they've actually looked at some of that, like doing PNF stretching, like contract, relax, trying to put some load and resistance into the stretch, you get better change, even, albeit short term. But I think that's probably where gymnasts excel as well, is that they're always actively controlling those positions. So the body probably accepts them more readily because it's in control of them, if that makes sense. But again, like, why do this? There's always, I want to be able to do the splits because I want to be able to snatch. There's almost nothing to correlate those two things. Like your split you could make that happen. You could do the splits. You could earn a split and like, wow, I can do that now. I never thought I'd be able to do the splits. And your snatch could look exactly the same. You have to do the snatch or variations thereof to get better at the snatch. And there's just no way around the specificity.
Yeah. No, it's definitely true. I think that, I mean, that kind of training is not a short-term sort of thing. It's just a whole different, it's like the one-arm pull-up. It's just like it seems simple because you can get partial of the way through it, but it's years ahead of not regular training goals. It's funny, we talked to Dave Durante. I don't know if you know him. And Dave was talking about, gymnasts measure skills and progression, acquiring them in months and years and sometimes decades. Whereas, most of the fitness industry looks at whatever their skill acquisition or their goal is in, weeks. And he was saying that once you take the monthly, yearly approach to acquiring certain things, in some skills, decades, then it's a much different way to train because, you have to preserve your body and do progression in a way that is sustainable for years. And if it's not, then you're not going to achieve those goals. And that's obviously something that just requires more patience and more long-term vision to get good at those things. Which is something you don't know when you're younger. But you learn.
I would argue that it's the only way to train. I would argue that that's the definition of training, and everything else is just, I don't know what it is, physical activity, exercise, but it's if it's not sustainable, what are you training? And you see the same thing with injury management and injury risk reduction as well. They get hurt or they have a surgery or whatever, and they want to be better now. And as soon as they feel better. So the number one thing that I see is as soon as the pain goes away, that person interprets that as, oh, I'm back. I'm ready. I need to make up for lost time. And what do? They jump right back into where they were weeks or months ago before they were hurt and try to think that they, for some reason, are not now deconditioned because they took weeks or months off. And then they get hurt again. And then it's just kind of this vicious cycle And that's when we start traveling down the rabbit hole and kind of like man, what's wrong with me? You know, is it because do I keep getting hurt because my glutes don't fire? Or is it because I'm missing, 5 degrees of hip internal rotation and that's why this keeps happening? Or in reality, is it because my programming wasn't sustainable and I didn't manage my injury very well and I didn't progress myself incrementally back into training the way I should have? And that's usually the issue.
Mm. Yeah, it seems like that just pain can be a really bad indicator for most people, because sometimes, you even get over the pain, but it looks worse than before you had the injury because you got some like weird compensation now. And that's why it's not hurting, because you're like shifting all your weight off the bad ankle or whatever.
Totally. Yeah. You see it all the time. And that probably makes you a little bit more susceptible. Because at some point, especially in like field sport athletes, the gym, I would say there's a reason why injury rates in CrossFit, weightlifting, powerlifting are so low, because it's a controlled environment. Even, the movements that you're going to get, the patterns, you can offload it, but you're still kind of in control of what's happening. Like you can always dump the weight, you know what I mean? Like in field sport or gymnastics or something like that, where things are a lot more unpredictable. You take a helmet to your kneecap, you're not going to expect that, but there's no way to prevent that. So I think those compensations that you see, like you just described, where you're offloading the limb, I think the risk is even higher in a field sport where you're going to be forced to use that limb, whether you like it or not. And if you're not prepared, your risk is increased, period. We can put it just like that. So it comes back to education, I think, because it's easy for us to say this, like, you just take it easy and trust the process. But, we've all been hurt and it sucks. So you need, and people don't know, if people perceive pain as a 1-to-1 to tissue damage or healed. So if they don't feel pain, I must be healed. If I do feel pain, I must be broken. And it's neither one is correct. So you got to find a middle ground, and you've got to allow yourself the time to kind of relearn the positions and the movements. And in that regard, especially in rehab, weight on the bar should almost be, you should look at it as a challenge to try to keep you out of the positions. And so you only use as much weight as you can control the movement. So the weight is there, purposely the weight is there to throw you off of the movements so that you can strengthen and reinforce your optimal movement patterns or your good habits. But we look at the weight on the bar as the gold standard. And no matter what, if the weight on the bar is heavier, that must be a good thing. Regardless of if we're moving in a certain way or it's not sustainable or we're having exacerbations, something like that. Well, at least weight's still going up. But if it's not sustainable, then we know like the cliff is coming. So, yeah.
No, it's a good point. It's a good point. Coming back to like the rehab pain thing, there's always an interesting observation that I make between basically what seems to appear on the surface as a very similar athlete. The athlete is generally pretty well muscled, but excessively tight and quite strong. And what I've always found is with that athlete, they're either one of two camps. They're either really tight and just super resilient, like all their positions suck, but they almost never get injured. And there's like the same athlete that can't hit the positions, all their positions suck, but they always get injured. They're both like very tight, very limited range of motion, a lot of compensation with their movement patterns, but for some reason, one is, plagued with injuries constantly, and one is just never injured. And I just thought you'd probably be a good person to ask as to like, maybe what is happening there? Is it a genetic thing? Is it just a luck thing? Is it what is generally happening? And I don't know if you've made a similar observation.
Yeah, totally. There's lots of factors when it comes to injuries. We got to define tight though, because again, we can't. So flexibility or range of motion, we're going to make a distinction that it has more to do with leverage and performance than it does injuries or injury management or injury risk reduction. Because on the other side of the coin, You can have somebody who has pristine positioning and their overhead squat is very Instagram worthy, and you're very jealous. They can just bury their overhead squat in their snatch, but they can get hurt too. So range of motion doesn't protect you from injuries. Range of motion potentially just gives you better leverages. You'll be able to snatch more weight if you can receive the bar lower. All things the same. If you pull the bar at the same height as somebody beside you, but you're able to go lower, you're going to be able to receive more weight. That's a performance conversation. Injuries are, as far as we can, the variables that we can manipulate, injuries are all about preparation. So the athlete, we take those examples, both athletes, regardless of if they're hitting positions as a coach that you deem sustainable and quote unquote good or bad. It doesn't really matter because injury is about preparation. So the athlete who's continually getting hurt very likely is spiking their training load beyond their recoverable capacity. And they're doing that repeatedly over time. And that could be in any one moment. So acutely, that was simply too heavy for the tissues to be able to tolerate. And, something goes like that. Yep. What you see in barbell sports is more of the overuse stuff, chronic stuff over time. So over time, the accumulation of their training load was either too concentrated or increased too steeply in too short a period of time. And their body started to tell them about it. So that pain, that threat perception is just that. It's kind of a danger signal. The body wants you to change something. You're not recovering. Your stress load is over, your stress bucket's overflowing. The other athlete who's hitting the exact same positions, but is tolerating the training. Now, I think that there are probably genetic factors. Those are things that we call them moderators, which is basically what buffers you from injury. What buffers that athlete to be able to handle the same workload but not get hurt. And genetics could certainly play a factor, but beyond just saying the word genetics, what qualities exactly, we don't know. We know that younger athletes are a little bit more resilient. So if you have that, so in those two examples, same training load, same positions, the younger athlete's probably going to be able to tolerate more concentrated training and steeper spikes in increases in either intensity or volumes from week to week, month to month. Having no injury history, that sounds stupid, but the best way to not get hurt, the best way to reduce your risk of injury is to not get hurt in the first place. Because like the number one risk factor for future injury is that you had one already, is previous injury. If you sprain an ankle the first time, you are simply more at risk to sprain that same ankle again, regardless of how well you rehab it. And we don't quite know why. Maybe the tissues never quite come back. Most people probably don't manage it correctly, and they're always kind of weakened and predisposed to a recurrence. But let's say that if you have two of these, you have that same athlete, they might have different injury histories. The one that's always getting hurt might have a history of always getting hurt. Now, why do they get hurt in the first place? Trace it back to the very, very first time. It's the same story. Load greater than capacity. So I'm always looking to optimize leverages and positions. And sometimes that equals more range of motion. Like it's always a goal from a physics biomechanics standpoint to optimize performance in that regard. But if I'm putting on the injury risk reduction hat, that doesn't have much to do with range of motion. Does that make sense? That distinction? Yeah. And that's the thing that I think that concept is hard, because I was the same way. I'm thinking like, well, you won't get hurt if you're able to get into a deeper position. But again, people who get into deep positions still get hurt, and there's no difference in injury rates. Those people can still spike their training beyond their recoverable capacity too. And one would argue that the body is actually protecting you. It's shortening your range of motion so that you don't go into those extremes because you can't control it. So like you actually have more room for error because you're not moving as far. Like you're not going to get hurt all the way down there at those extreme ranges of motion where the joints are most stressed, because you're staying in the middle anyway. So my thought is, like with those examples, always look at the modifiable risk factors, and the modifiable risk factors are training load and training history.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
I think it's a good distinction. I like the idea of the injury history thing because, if you look at, if I'm thinking about the examples I had in my head of those people, that is probably the biggest factor, is that the one person that gets injured most often is always injured, and they never let that injury heal. And that other person that has that one injury that I've known about in like the last 7 years, as soon as they got injured, they just took heaps of time off that joint. They just did proper rehab, they got it sorted, and they just trained around it really well. And so, it's like maybe they are very similar in how they move in their positions. But if one person's constantly injured and is not letting it heal, and they're using, like you said, pain as the only thing to know if they're healthy or not, if they're ready or not to go back to training, then they're already making a mistake, because it's like you just explained, it's not the only thing that is determining when people are ready to get back into it. So, that is the next question I have, is like, how can someone know when it's safe to get back into it, right? How long do I need? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? Is it a day? Like, when can they get back to being a boss again, after hurting their back, deadlifting way too much weight?
Yeah. What's funny is you mentioned like the person who got hurt, who's more resilient, seems to not get injured. Well, maybe they had an injury, 5-6 years ago, but they managed it well. And you gave the example of, they took time off of the thing that hurt them. And I think, and then people are always poo-pooing that and be like, wow, doctors are always telling you to just take time off and take time off. And that, that recommendation is not wrong when it's acute. When it first happens, like if you sprain your ankle and it blows up like a grapefruit and it's black and blue, don't go jump up and down on it. Don't go play another basketball game or play another soccer game. Like, chill for a little bit and let the tissues actually heal. That's kind of a no-brainer, but people don't do it. They keep sensitizing and keep pushing that injured joint. And then what happens is that it turns chronic. So if you have any soft tissue injury, should heal in a roughly finite amount of time. Like from 0 to 12 weeks, most tissues in the body can fully heal. Nerves are kind of the exception because they take forever to heal. And then there's some like healing capacity limitations we know with, certain injuries with paralysis and those types of things. But we're talking about muscle strains, ligaments, these types of things. Around 12 weeks is where things are put back together on the cellular level. And now it's just about grading the exposure to load again. That's rehab. But what people do is from that 0 to 12 weeks, they just keep pounding the thing. And so it never gets the chance to heal. And now the pain signals are not as accurate, meaning eventually the tissues will heal, but maybe in a not so optimal way as far as fiber alignment, but the sensitivity doesn't go away because you basically conditioned your nervous system to stay that way because you never took time off. Or you never deloaded the area in the first place. And what the kicker is, though, that when things become chronic, so that person that now has a 5-year history of chronic knee pain or like chronic tendon pain when they jump or land or cut or squat, taking time completely off is now the opposite of what you should do. And there's plenty of data. I don't know if you guys have history of this. If you've got training will actually make you feel a little bit better. And you'll have people tell you that my issue or whatever it is actually gets worse if I don't train. So that's the kicker is in the chronic situations. Now we're not dealing with necessarily an acute structural inflammatory issue that we need to let calm down. We're dealing with more of a sensitization, more of a chronic conditioned response where the tissue's healing is adequate, but the nervous system has conditioned it to be always in threat or always vulnerable. And we're human, so we do things to extreme. So when we feel good, we either push too far or we don't do enough. And then there's that Goldilocks example. So to your question of like, when do I know how to get back into things? It kind of depends on the issue that you're dealing with, but whether it's acute or chronic, acute being it just happened. Like I pulled my back muscle yesterday doing a deadlift, or I pulled my back muscle during a deadlift a year ago and I still haven't deadlifted. If it's the latter, we need to do something because there's more factors than just deadlifting at that point. And you've probably had clients like this. They're scared. Now they're fear avoidant to the movement. and they're apprehensive to the movements, and they're conditioned to think that they're broken. And that cycle kind of can get worse over time because they start reading on the internet. They're looking at like back braces and shit when they're 22 years old, that type of thing. So if somebody's coming to me with a chronic issue, meaning that it's lasted beyond the normal healing constraints or normal healing response, we are pretty much immediately working back into some variation of the movement, not just for them to gain strength and physical attributes, but for them to be less fear avoidant to the movement. We got to start reconditioning not only their local tissues, but their brain. I mean, honestly, that biopsychosocial aspect of pain. So I think that in acute situations, so it's the person who hurt their back yesterday and now they can't bend over, I'm probably looking at normalizing range of motion before loading it. So, and that doesn't mean not doing deadlifts. We might have to do rack pulls or something like that. But the range of, if it's acute, meaning like 3 months or less, we should probably be working back into pain-free ranges of motion. So if it's somebody who literally can't bend over now because of that pulled back muscle from deadlifting, then we're probably not deadlifting. We're working on just range of motion drills. They're laying on their back and they're pulling their knees to their chest, like real basic stuff, or they're doing back extensions with tempo, just body weight, just to the range of motion that they can control. We're trying to restore that range of motion again because it's reduced for a reason. You know, the body's protecting. That's why the body locks you down like that, is it wants you to not do the thing that hurt you. So it's that response is there for a reason. And so we'll let Mother Nature do her thing and we'll just coax that range of motion back. And as soon as we get some that's viable enough for some type of deadlift variation, I'm using the back example, then we'll start to do that. And we may, go empty bar first, those types of things. It's not much different for the chronic case. It's just that I'm not necessarily as worried about any type of acute inflammatory response. I'm not necessarily worried about getting in Mother Nature's way. I'm more worried about reconditioning that person's belief system and negative narratives that they've built around the movement itself. That's more of the issue. So on paper, it might actually not look much different. And if somebody's ever thinking, like, when should I work back into things? It's, as long as that pain isn't shooting down your legs and your feet aren't going numb, or if it's your shoulder, your hand's not going limp and it's just local discomfort, you can start playing around with, ask a coach. It's what they get paid for. What's a variation that I can do that maybe is like a press if my shoulders hurt? What's a better, easier variation? Oh, single arm press. A single arm press with reduced range of motion. You could just take your arm down to a box that stops you right there and just press from there and go real slow. So that, because speed increases force too. So tempo is something that we can manipulate to get you back into lifting, but it's self-limiting. It makes you use light weights. The mistake is people's question is, when can I get back into things? That means when can I train the way that I want to train? And that's a different conversation than when can we start working back into the movement? We can't answer the first one until we start doing the second one. So we gotta flip the order.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough for people to take things slow, like you said, take the long-term approach to training. How much do you think that, you mentioned sort of like the mother, not getting Mother Nature's way sort of thing? There's always like a interesting discussion that seems to pop up on this show about, the barbell and its actual use or its benefit beyond a certain point, like the diminishing returns. It seems like it can become more of a weapon of destruction for the general population than something that's actually causes any good. Whatever you pick the number at, 80 to 90% plus, for just so many reasons, right? For people just with sedentary lifestyles and not prepping properly and bad form and all this sort of stuff, poor coaching, whatever you want to put it down to. How much do you think that it's useful, at the higher percentages for just general pop sort of stuff?
Yeah, that's an interesting conversation. I frame things towards people's goals. So I'm always about consent. So let's say, 55-year-old David, whatever, I'm trying to think of the name here. 55-year-old David comes into my office and he's like, I've never done any of this stuff, but I watched it on TV and I watched it on YouTube and I watched it on Instagram and it looks really cool. And I want to do it. I want to do powerlifting or I want to do weightlifting. We have a conversation that you have no training history. I'm cool with you doing this because that's what you want to do. Who am I to tell you what you want to do if that's your goal? But you have no training history, which means that we could do this the wrong way real quick. And so we just need to be very, very careful about how we progress things. And there won't be a need for a max out session for a very long time. And it goes even further than that. If it's 55-year-old David who's like, I don't really care about competing or maxing out. I just want to use it to get stronger. I just want to build some muscle. And in that respect, there's really no need to push those higher percentages because we know that strength, just the ability to produce force, can be improved at those lower percentages. And newbie gains, new people get strong using almost next to nothing as far as percentages because they have no other preparation. Their ceiling is so high. And we also know that hypertrophy can be attained with lower percentages. So it really just depends on the person's goals. If that person still is like, my goal is to increase my 1 rep max, like that's why I do this. Okay. But it's just a conversation that has to be had. Because sometimes I don't feel that your preparation warrants that. You've never gone above 70%. So it wouldn't make any sense for us to go to 90% or above anytime within the next 3 months because we need to build to that. So it's all about preparation. I guess I come back to that all the time. But I do think there's a risk reward cost benefit. And that's across athletes too. Here in America, American football's our most popular sport, but you see collegiate running backs squatting 500-600 pounds. And it's like, do you really need to do that? What's the difference between you being able to squat 500 and you being able to squat 600? Does that extra 100 pounds equate to something on the field? Or could you maintain a 500-pound squat and then go work on your craft or go develop power and speed? So obviously like powerlifting and weightlifting and CrossFit and barbell sports aside, because literally that is the sport, lift the most weight. I do think the conversation has to be had of risk reward, diminishing returns, no matter who you are. I'm just very clear. I think it all comes down to expectations. Like you got to set the tone right away. And if you don't think somebody's appropriate to do a certain thing, that conversation needs to be had as soon as possible. And they need to have a rationale for that. And the rationale is usually you don't have the history, you don't have the training experience for this. We can certainly establish that, but it's going to take time. We got to hit XYZ milestones first. And maybe those milestones are smaller increments or volume goals. You've got to be able to do 4 sets of 5 at this weight before I'm going to let you bump up and try a heavy set of 3 at this weight or something like that, But that way, as a coach, like you're looking at their training log and you can see that you haven't really been increasing intensity or volume maybe more than 10% from week to week. And now they've got 6 to 8 months under their belt of training. You're probably more comfortable with them pushing their threshold a little bit because it's not as steep of a jump. But yeah, it's all about their goals and their preparation.
Yeah, I think maybe it was you on another podcast. I'm pretty sure it was. You were with it's like strength scientists or sports scientists or something. It's the other juggernaut guys. Chad was on there, and you were talking about with your training programs, what you want to see from your athletes is them having the least amount of spikes in just however their training looks of all sorts of factors. You want that line to be as smooth as possible so that they're not jumping back in too aggressively or not training, too intensely, too quickly. And you were saying that, the highest injury rates happen in collegiate sports after the off season when people have done nothing and now they're trying to survive the absolute beatdown of preseason. And I think it just relates to anyone can relate to this from just a sort of mindset perspective. When they have any sort of time off, when they get sick or they go on holidays and they come back, that is when they're most vulnerable, because now they're like, all right, got to make up for lost time to add more weight than I was, doing at my peak. And that is when the body's the least conditioned and least ready to do those sorts of things.
And you're often feeling strong because you like haven't lifted for a while, right?
Yeah.
You're like, let's
feel fresh.
this.
Yeah.
Fatigue is decayed. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Honestly, that point that you made is spot on. And that alone has probably shaped my practice more than anything in the last 5 years. And it sounds so stupid, doesn't it? It's like, don't do too much too soon and try not to max out after a long layoff. But it's like, but first of all, we break those rules all the time. So just because it's simple doesn't mean it's adhered to. And second of all, there are, the concept of the spikes thing is so underutilized, but it's so simple. We're always looking to fix the person. Like we always think, oh, you got injured because there must be something wrong with you. Something's not firing. Something's not going into that position. But we fail to actually more like take a step back or five steps back and look at the big picture of the athlete's preparation. So when we say like spikes, we're looking at just training increase over time. So we all know that if you want to get better at something, you've got to do more of that thing over time. And if it's a barbell sport, metrics need to increase over time. Absolute intensity, average intensity, volume, depending on the phase of training that we're in. You're looking for those trends to increase over time. But what increases your risk is the concentration of the increase. I like very simply, when I give context to people, I ask them what their program always like, when did this thing first start to happen? When were you first experiencing this issue? So we'll find that inflection point. But then I rewind 2 or 3 months. What was your training looking like before that? Because that's really where the magic was happening, or the black magic. Things were accumulating. And then when they started to feel something, that was already the overflow. Like that's the end of things having kind of gone awry. That's your body being like, all right, I can't handle this. Something needs to change. We're giving you the warning shot now. So if you dive into their history, a lot of times they'll be like, oh yeah, before I got hurt, I was doing German squat volume 10 by 10. And I was also, the CrossFit Open was in a month. So we were training for that. And I just started this new Catalyst Athletics weightlifting program. And it's like, so you see these inflection points. Or I changed coaches and we started a strength block when I had only been doing hypertrophy for 6 months. Or I got a new job and my training didn't change at all, but my sleep changed. And then 2 months later, I started to feel issues. So stress is stress, right? But you find those inflection points. Usually what I tell people, their programs are usually pretty good. I mean, like you do anything long enough, you're going to get better at it. So just keep coming to the gym. Like the program itself matters, but like consistency is what matters the most. So I'll look at their program that they were doing and I was like, it's not bad, but I'll tell them from this point, let's say 8 weeks before they started to get hurt to the time that they got hurt, I'll tell them that in this 8-week period, you made these amount of gains. Because usually a lot of times people will get hurt after like they've been doing really well. It's like training was going really well. I was PRing. I felt like really strong. And then this happened. And so I'll say, okay, let's take that exact 8-week block. What if we had done that same thing, but we stretched it out to 12 weeks? Or stretch it out to 14 or even 16 weeks, something like that. So you reach the end point the same way. You still got to those numbers, but the level, the spike, the slope was much more level. And then I'll tell them there's a good chance that we wouldn't be having this conversation right now if you had done that. That's always hindsight though, because they're sitting in my office hurt. So like, it's like, well, thanks, doc. But that's the problem is right now, all the data is retrospective. We don't have a whole lot of like prospective data to say this is the sweet spot. There is some acute to chronic workload ratio type research out there with like Australian rules football and rugby and cricket and soccer and these types of things where they're starting to look at ratios of this week's work compared to like last month's work. And they're starting to, if like you fall within a certain ratio of 80% of 0.8 to 1.3, meaning this week I'm doing 80% of my average in the past month, all the way up to 130%. that tends to be a sweet spot. Like you're in the clear, your injury risk is minimal. If you go below that, if you do too little, your injury risk increases. If you do too much, your injury risk increases. But we need more research. We need more bigger sample sizes, more sports to really hone in on those ratios. But so I'm telling the person now, well, we should have spread that out. It was too concentrated. It's useful though, because we could run that exact same program. Now we at least have some data. I know that that was your max, that was beyond your maximum recoverable volume, to quote Mike Israetel, from Renaissance Periodization. That was beyond your MRV, clearly. So if we run that same exact training block, but we stretch it out a few more weeks, let's see if you can recover from that. And your rehab can just be your training. We just have to level out those curves. And then to your point, vacations or for whatever reason, people taking time off, significant time off, the worst thing that you can do is come back and max out. They always, the athletes always say that. I just want to see where I'm at, or I just wanted to see where I was. Why? Like, you haven't been training, things are probably not going to feel great. And or like you said, you're going to get tricked because now you don't have any fatigue because you haven't done anything. And yeah, maybe you can pull a heavy snatch, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be able to now just max out day after day and PR day after day. We can't trick ourselves like that. Because I've come back from vacation and PR'd or come close to pulling like a PR snatch. And I'm like, holy shit, I found the secret to training. It's not training. I can just take time completely off and then I'm better than I was. And so you try to ride that wave for like 3 days and then you feel like you got run over by a truck and you have to take a deload after, being on vacation for a month. So if we can track our programs a little bit better, it doesn't take rocket science, just even very simple metrics like tonnage, sets times reps times weight. Just track that increase from week to week. This like 10% increase is kind of a very generic guideline, no more than a 10% increase from week to week. If you're younger, no injury history, pretty robust training history, you can get away with more. If you're older or you have a tendency to get hurt or you don't have much of a training history, I would probably adhere to that 10% or maybe even a little bit less. But what you'll find is if you really look at your programs, it's like, oh man, I spiked my tonnage or my average intensity 30% from that week to this week, or 50% in a month. And then the week later, that's when I got hurt. You start to see these trends. So I think it's very, very important.
Yeah, it's interesting that when a lot of our clients want to do more training, the first thing they want to do is add more sets and reps to what they're already doing instead of looking at potentially other training that could complement or supplement what they're already doing. And that's usually a much better path because you're going to obviously train different patterns and, reduce imbalances and increase stability. But instead it's like, well, we've only been doing 3x3. I was thinking of doing maybe 10x3, just to get a little bit stronger. Well, it's like, well, it's not always the path of getting stronger. And they're like, yeah, we just kind of like, just need a bit more like barbell work in the program. It's like, you've already got heaps of barbell work. Like if you add more barbell work, you could get injured. And like, why not add more ring work? Why not add, more single leg stability work? It's always a weird way that people just want to add more of what they're already doing rather than more variability.
Well, it's kind of like what you said. They're just in a rush. We're just all in a rush. We want it now. If you do the math, I'll see that what you just said too. Like, okay, the workout this week was 4 sets of 5 at 100 kilos. We're just arbitrary numbers. I'm just making stuff up. But the tendency is definitely people want to add a set, they want to add a rep, and then they want to add weight. It's like so 4x5 at 100 kilos. Okay, next week I'm going to do 5 sets of 6 at 110. And it seems like very reasonable. It's like, okay, I'm only adding 1 set, I'm only adding 1 rep, and I'm only adding a little bit of weight. But if you do the math, we talk about those increases, that's a crazy jump. So like if I take 4 times 5 times 100, 4 times 5 times 100, that's arbitrary, like tonnage is just kind of like pounds or kilos, right? It's 2,000. If I take 5 times 6 times 110, now we're at 3,300. 2,000 divided by 3,300, that's a 40% increase from that week. And it would be the same, like you can do the math, you can start playing around with these numbers, even just adding a set. Going from 4 sets of 5 to 5 sets of 5 is a decent jump. Like that's even more. So I think people just don't understand how quickly they spike their training, and then they wonder why, what happened. Well, we never track any of that stuff. So nobody goes back and looks, and it's like, oh, I screwed this up. It was the dosage. I think that's the term that resonates with me the most, is like if a physician prescribed you X dosage of some type of medication, it could be the perfect medication for exactly what you need. If you take 4 times the recommended dosage and you experience side effects, you're not going to wonder why. You're like, well, that was stupid. I got high, but now I'm shitting myself, that type of thing. So it's like, but if we overdose training, then we don't blame the dosage of the thing. We blame something else, right? I usually try to, because the goal is still to increase, I'm still want to increase these metrics over time, but I try to find a little balance, a little undulation, manipulating sets and reps and weight. And this is easier for general population who are just trying to do just work in general. It's as far as weightlifting or powerlifting is concerned, we're either trying to build volume or we're trying to build intensity, based on the phase. But like that 4 times 5 times 100 example, maybe next week it'll be 4 times 6 for 100. And so we're just adding 1 rep to each set, or even 4 times 6 for 95 kilos or whatever. So I added a rep, but we dropped the intensity. So you give some and you take some. And then we could go back to 4 by 5 at 105, like the next week. So we dropped the reps, but you gave it a little bit of intensity. So we're just kind of undulating those variables over time. Tonnage is still going to increase, but it's going to be that little wave pattern. And I think that's a little bit more sustainable than just adding sets or like 10 kilos every time you come to the gym. This like very, very linear approach. You hit the wall quicker that way.
Yeah. A lot of clients, when they start out, they're not ever taught about the newbie gains and the beginner's progress. And so that mindset, even though you evolve their training program, you never evolve their mindset. You never have a conversation with them about what you need to, set their expectations up correctly in the future. They kind of understand it from a conceptual thing that, it's not always going to be like this, but they don't really accept it and they don't really believe it. So they kind of have this mental pattern of going, I got to win every single workout. I've always got to increase weight on the bar because that's what I used to be able to do. And if I can't do that anymore in the future, I'm getting worse. But it's like, no, body is not this linear adaptation machine. It's like, like you said, it's going to have waves. It's going to vary. And if you're trying to win workouts like you were trying to win workouts when you first started, that's when I see like people's long-term progress really stall out. And that's when they really give up on training. They give up on progress because it's like, man, I have not PR'd in ages. It's like, well, it's not really the point anymore, is it? Like the point is to stay healthy and make long-term progress. And they just see themselves as a failure. They get depressed on training. They come in and they're just like, I don't want to do this anymore because I'm not good at it like I used to be. But you could be good at anything when you start. You make, like you said, you make progress on looking at the weights,
Yeah, totally. And there's, with linear, I was at a seminar and there was, one of the speakers was more of kind of the starting strength approach. And he was talking about, with his team sport athletes in the weight room, it's like, I only have these athletes for 2 or 3 months, 3 months maximum in the off season. There's no real need to get fancy because they're all kind of new to lifting. Like lifting is not their sport. So we do 3 sets of 5 and we just add 2.5 pounds every session they come in. And I was thinking, and the argument was they only have 2 sessions a week and they only have them for 2 or 3 months. And the goal is to get stronger. And the way that I guarantee they get stronger just from being able to produce more force is just add a little bit of weight on the bar every time they come to the gym. And that seems conceptually against what we're talking about. But when you think about it, they're keeping the reps and sets pretty much the same. And they're just changing one variable. And it's a very, very small change. And if they do plateau, I asked them, I was like, well, what happens if somebody does hit a plateau or they have a more extensive training age? And says, yeah, that's where we will switch up the variables a little bit. We'll add a little bit of volume and keep the weight the same, these types of things. But I don't think beginners just don't quite understand that. Like I always tell them, ride that wave as long as you can. if we all go over there and use those 0.5 kilo fractional plates every time you come to the gym, or, you know, like that would be awesome if you could just PR for the next 3 years. But they hit that ceiling way too fast because they watch everybody around them. And I get it. And I don't know if that's truly, like, I don't know what we can do about that as far as like preventing that mindset, especially in the private sector when people are paying out of their pocket and they're paying you. They see these other hard charging athletes and they see them all on the internet, and they're giving you money to do that type of training. Like, you just naturally, as humans, we want to get there. And we don't quite understand that those people that we're watching on the internet have put a whole lot of time and training into what they're doing. They're doing the thing that you don't want to do. But it's us coaches. We just got to be patient and say it like it's the first time we said it.
Yeah.
You know, I repeat myself all the time to the same person over and over. And I try to say it like it's the first time I said it.
Yeah. It's a tough battle, but you know, it's just kind of how we are as humans, and it's just part of the job. I actually wanted to, before we jump into our final 4 questions, I wanted to kind of drift back to something we mentioned at the start. There was let's just maybe give you a bit more context. I don't know if you've heard recently, but basically the CrossFit Games has had all the funding pulled out of it, and there's no more regionals. There's like big, massive changes in the CrossFit world, and it's been a move back to CrossFit for health. So investing the millions of dollars that they sink into the CrossFit Games every year back into helping people get off the couch, helping CrossFit affect more lives of the everyday person, and not have people want to be the next Matt Fraser, Rich Froning sort of thing. And one of the paths they started to walk down was really cool, but obviously the games took priority in terms of the media, and this was offline. So offline was basically a roundtable discussion in the community that the CrossFit HQ had put on, and you were in one episode talking about the knees out, which was a super hot topic for a long time in CrossFit, because sort of the pioneer of that movement was a guy called Kelly Starrett, who from a business sense was super smart. He was putting out tons of content to basically a content-less, that's even a word, area of training in the CrossFit world, which was mobility. And one of the things he started talking about was getting, and I mean, a lot of OGs would remember this, but a lot of new people wouldn't, is he had a weightlifter called Diane Fu, and he was getting her knees to track well over her toes, to the point that the entire joint of the knee from the edge, from like the most medial part to the lateral part, was outside the outside part of the foot, even with knee sleeves on. So I was like, extreme. And it brought up this whole discussion about like hip torque and all this sort of stuff. Could you take us through a little bit of what happened at that roundtable, and kind of what you were kind of arguing from your experiences, with the knees out thing? Because some people still do it. It's not as common anymore, but some people are still kind of in that boat of shoving your knees out as far as possible to create maximum hip torque to squat the most weight and be injury free.
Yeah, it's a big time. I did that show 5 years ago, almost exactly. CrossFit HQ flew me out pretty much exactly 5 years ago this December. So, and then I wrote an article. I wrote a blog. The reason that I did that show was because they got wind of a blog post that I wrote called "Supple Leopards versus the World." My take on the knees out debate. Because the debate started well before I got into it. It was with a weightlifting coach named Bob Takano and another healthcare professional. And then Kelly kind of got roped in because they were talking about his, some of the teachings with that MWOD. And then I wrote that blog, and that blog blew up because it was very spicy, and I called Kelly out directly on the blog. What's ironic about it is that it's something that I would never write now. I would never write that blog now. 5 years later, would never do that because I wouldn't want that type of attention now. But it was the thing that allowed me to then work, have other platforms. It's very ironic how things like that work. Like the stupid douchey 5 years younger me I'm glad that I was that way because I wouldn't do that now. But anyway, the blog, was a rebuttal to the teachings of pushing the knees outside of the plane of the foot during the squat. There's several points. You read that blog. It was on Dark Side Strength. It was on Juggernaut. It's the first Juggernaut. It was the first blog that they put up, but of me. Essentially, the argument of the knees out is safer. We can rebut that in several forms. The ACL. So some people will say, well, if your knees go in during the squat, your ACL is at risk for injury, your ACL ligament in your knee. Valgus is a mechanism of ACL tear. So valgus being when your knees go in, but it's valgus when your knee is damn near straight. So your ACL is most tensioned when the knee is locked straight. So most 99.99% of ACL tears that you see are when the knee is either locked straight or at about 30 degrees of flexion, so damn near straight. You see it when people cut, when people land, like as soon as they land, boom, gone. Single leg lands. In the bottom of a squat, when the knee is bent, the ACL is on slack. So the ACL injury tear risk is almost nil at the bottom of a squat. Your ACL is not tensioned at the bottom of a squat. You can't tear it. There are lifters who have had catastrophic injuries and they've torn their ACL in squatting. It's very, very rare. And a lot of times it was a predisposed condition. Like a very prominent powerlifter tore both his ACLs at the bottom of a squat, but it was only after his stress fracture and his patella snapped at the bottom. So his patella snapped in two, then his patellar tendon snapped, and then his ACL, there was nothing else holding the knee together. And that knee went.
Makes me never want to squat heavy again.
Is that
when that knee went? Well, there was nothing holding the other knee. The other knee had 800 pounds, and then that knee went. So it's very. And there was another. There's other weightlifters who I know have torn their ACL coming out of the clean, but it was when they stood up and the bar oscillated back down when they were standing. So the ACL is not at risk at the bottom of a squat. Now the other thing is the meniscus of the knee. Basically, that cartilaginous ring that's like a shock absorber. We have two of them on each knee, the medial and lateral meniscus, and it's kind of like a shock absorber, a jacket, if you can think of it like that. And if your knee has weird twists and turns, like if your femur and your tibia don't just open and close like a door, but they twist kind of this way on a Z-axis a little bit more than the knee is made for, which is not made for a whole lot, then the meniscus could be at risk for injury. So the thought is, well, if you have this weird valgus or like internal torque of the knee, that would be injurious to the meniscus. So let me now just overcorrect and shove my knees way out. But now you get the same thing. If your feet are completely straight and you shove your knees way out to the side, you're putting a weird twist in your knee, just like you would be the other way. So it was like a gross overcorrection. It's giving you the same problem, just in varus instead of valgus. So my thing was just let your knee bend and straighten in its normal natural plane right over the middle of the foot. If your knees are coming in during the squat, the weight is simply too heavy. You are simply not strong enough to support the load. And there's some, we're not even going down the rabbit hole of some elite lifters using an internal rotation moment or a valgus moment on purpose to get themselves out of a squat. I won't even go down that hole because it just kind of even almost confirms our point that movement is variable and dependent on the task. But if you've got an athlete who can't control that knee position and they're just diving in, take some weight off their back. It's real simple. The shoving their knee out is not going to be a fix. You mentioned Diane Fu's pictures. You can see those in his book. And I'm comfortable talking about this stuff because these are just facts. So her picture is in the book and the cue is shove her knees out to the max of their range. And it is a picture of her with her toes completely forward and her knees shoved way out. The kicker is though, that she's lifting an empty bar. And if you Google image photos of Diane Fu doing actual weightlifting, where she's snatching and squatting actual weight, you will see her toes are pointed out and you will see her knees are straight in line with her feet. And it looks nothing like the picture that was referenced in the book. So I think the body tends to just normalize itself anyway. And so my thought was, why don't we just normalize the movement from the beginning instead of this overcorrection, essentially? And so those were basically the points I made on the video. Yeah.
It just shows you, though, like if someone is finding those positions under load, they are heading for an injury very quickly. And that is generally what I saw a lot in my experience with that period of time, where elite level CrossFitters who are the best adapters, right? The best athletes are the best adapters. They were doing maximal loads with a knees out, toes forward position, completely unnatural. And there was a whole host of injuries that came along with that. One of the main issues, though, outside of injuries, was people just weren't making progress in their squat anymore. I saw people stall on years, like a full year of injury-free squatting cycles, just not improved because they manipulated their squat in such a way that it wasn't working. That pattern isn't strong.
Well, you mentioned the word torque, and that was that word was just overused so badly just a few years back. But it was about creating an external rotation torque in your hips, or shoving your knees out. Not the magic wasn't the knees going outside of the feet; it was the external rotation torque that you were creating in the hip. So we have to back up and define torque. Torque is just rotational force about an axis. So every time that you move a joint, I'm moving my shoulder here on the video, I'm creating a flexion torque. So every time we move, we're creating torque. Torque's a real thing. Torque is a thing in cars and lots of physics and engineering and these types of things. So we do create torque. It's the types of torque that we want. Like, what direction are we going to move? So just ask yourself in a squat, where is the most movement happening? The most excursion of moving? You're just standing up. You're sitting down and you're standing up. It's in that just straight plane. It's kind of like sagittal plane, but it's more of just wherever your feet are fixed. But from there, it's the torque into the floor. That is all we care about. The torque about the hip joint axis that produces force into the floor. You sit down, you stand up. If you're shoving your knees out, creating an external rotation torque about the hip, that direction of force is not in line with the direction that we're trying to move. And neither is knees going in necessarily. So if you got one knee that's basically touching the other knee, and that's where you're stalling out your squat, yeah, we're probably going to intervene there too, because that's not conducive to performance. Forget injury for a second. You're just not moving the weight. But it's the same with the other direction. So people, if you worry about dissipating your power in the wrong direction, then that's counterintuitive to the movement, period. And that's probably what we see is people stalling in their squat because they're not putting the torque into the direction that we're actually trying to get. And I think the forcing, because it wasn't just knees out, it was forcing the feet forward. It was somehow this gold standard of your feet you should be able to squat full depth with your feet forward. That should be a gold standard. That's what you're trying to attain. And that concept totally ignores anatomy, and it just totally ignores human variability. Our squat stance is about as unique as our fingerprint. I mean, I'm exaggerating there, but there are many, many factors that dictate your squat stance beyond what you can force to happen. And it has everything to do with your anatomy and your leverages, and much less to do with us having some type of gold standard. The people that you see who can squat very deeply with load, that's the performance squat with a narrow toes forward stance, have very likely always been able to do that. They were born with that ability to be able to do that. And if you try to shove them out into a different position, it's not comfortable. In the same exact way that somebody who can squat ass to grass with load, with a toe out and a little wider of a stance, if you try to shove them into a narrow toes forward stance, it's not going to be real comfortable or sustainable. And I don't think there's a whole lot of potential for us to change bony anatomy. And why do we care? So we take from an extreme example, I played college football and I was always in a quarter squat. That was the athletic stance. And my toes were forward because number one, I didn't want the opponent to know which direction I was going to go. I wanted to be able to change direction either way. I didn't want to bias myself to any one direction. So I had my toes forward, but I was only in a quarter squat. I wasn't in the maximum range of motion that my hips could go in. But when we're talking about a deep, deep squat, you then have to respect the way that you're built if you want to be able to attain those positions. So that was the other piece about it. It was the foot position that was probably more limiting for people, honestly, as far as squat depth is concerned.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think it was a pretty fair breakdown of the squats. It's just a shame it wasn't
they need
really
to bring back
spoken about
offline
in the video. Yeah, maybe they need to. Maybe 5 years on, they need to bring back
They
Dr.
should.
Quinn versus Dr. Kelly.
Hey, and I want to make the point, we're talking about concepts and principles here. Kelly happened to be in the conversation because he was involved, but it wouldn't matter if it was him or anybody else. My discussion is on the principles that we're talking about, and certainly not making any type of personal distinction. But they did a show on the kipping pull-up, the dangers of the kipping pull-up. I can't remember what the first one was. I'm pretty sure the one after hours was supposed to be performance enhancing drugs in CrossFit. It was supposed to be a discussion of PEDs in CrossFit. I don't know if they ever did it, but ours was the last show. So I don't know if it was you know what, this is probably hurting us more than it's helping us kind of thing, and they just nixed it or what. But that could have been it could have got real popular.
Well, there's always opportunity to bring it back now that the games is not the priority. So
true.
Hey, let's make an unofficial push for it as of this moment. So we'll see what they can come up with. No, that's good. That's good. So Quinn, we're going to jump into our final 4 questions. I'm curious about the first one because of your background and obviously all the people you've been exposed to. So first question we have is what is someone or who is someone that you would interview today if you had an opportunity that is alive and would answer anything that you ask them openly and honestly?
Let's see. I'm going to come back to me on that one. I'm going to think about that one.
Yeah, no worries. The second question is who or what is something that you do every single day that is, absolutely essential to the success of the day? A routine or a habit or some kind of ritual that you do?
Yeah. I think rituals are really important. It's just something that this year I've been trying to really hone in on, and my ritual has definitely evolved. So, and I want to tell you one that sounds super stupid, and I thought it was really stupid not too long ago, but I make my bed every morning now. And I was always against the idea. I'm 31 years old. I never made my bed for the first 30 and a half years. Because I thought it was stupid. I was like, I'm going to mess it up anyway. But it's not about making the bed. It's about the routine. It's like I get up, I do the same thing every morning, and it just starts the day off right. Now that doesn't have to be making the bed for people, but I think you should have. So I also will take 5 minutes and meditate. I'll use various apps for that. Headspace is an app that I use. But so I'll make my bed. I'll meditate for 5 minutes, and then I'll take a little walk outside. And I generally wake up right when the sun rises. So it just kind of sets that rhythm. It gets you know what I mean? Like you kind of get in rhythm with the sun and all that good stuff, but it just sets the tone for the day. And there's also something to be said for clutter. And I think there's some data on this. Like if your living space or your workspace is cluttered, that adds this low level subconscious stress. So if you're already stressed about stuff and then you come home and your stuff is just all over the place, you come home and now you have to fix something just to use it, then that adds to your stress. It adds to your fatigue. So if I can come in from a long day and open the door to my room and my bed's nice and neat and made and my room's clean, that's a nice place to be. And then I can just use it. You know what I mean? Now bed is just my bedroom is like a relaxing area. I can just chill, and my bed is for sleep and these types of things. But if it's all scattered and everything's around, I don't even want to be in there. Mm-hmm. So I think making the bed is, short answer is that's been something that I changed, and I've been evolving my habits to try to find what works. And that one thing has stuck, and it's made a difference, and I can't explain it really, but I think morning rituals are really important. I think the morning sets the tone for the night. When people talk about their nightly rituals being important, and they are, I think starting the day is another one. I also get up earlier so I don't turn my phone on for the first hour and a half that I'm awake, which makes a huge difference. But yeah.
Nice.
What's number 3? Come back to number 1.
We're going back to number 1?
No, go to 3.
I'll go to 3. All right. So third question is, it's a tough one, but is there anything recently that you feel like, you were a really strong believer and you kind of really push, you would preach a lot, but now you've changed your mind on it?
Oh, lots of stuff. I would say the mobility modalities. I was the guy who would spend, it's probably why I'm so passionate about it now, is because I'm biased, because I was the guy who would literally warm up for an hour and a half. And my warm up was hooking a band to literally every joint in my body, foam rolling every single piece of soft tissue that I could, lacrosse ball, all the crevices. And it was like, I was doing that and having zero carryover to my movements. I made a post, and I'm one of the guys who, as far as movement and positioning, probably looks like 180 degree difference. I actually made a post a few months ago on it. I posted a snatch of me from I can't remember, 2007 maybe or something, 2006, 2007. And then now it's completely different. And that's when I was warming up, and I just didn't understand tissue adaptation, and I didn't understand motor skill acquisition. I was the same guy that we've been talking about this whole time. So when I started to actually look into the literature, yep, that's it. Look at that.
Oh, man.
Yeah. I've got so many more videos way back in the day of that. Is that just...
And your spine does like a nice little...
look at it. Yeah, I know. What was I doing?
Look at that filth.
In the middle of the snatch.
That filth on the left. What is that?
And that was my depth. I couldn't squat any lower than that because of that position. And I was just going heavy and heavy. I wasn't giving my chance to actually learn the positions. So the evolution that I've come to now is respecting specificity of movement and understanding that there are thresholds to learning any new task. And I don't care if it's playing a piano, shooting a free throw, doing a barbell snatch. You've got to find where your limitations are and figure out how to challenge yourself in a way that you can still be focused and conscious in your practice. And not in a way that you're just in survival mode. Like not like you're positioning and you're just pulling on this heavy snatch and hoping that your body somehow does something different than it will before. And it's just doesn't work like that. So I took all the time that I spent doing all that extra stuff, and I put it into doing different snatch variations with lighter weights. And it took me a really, really long time, because that was me after a collegiate football background where all we did was powers and we just strapped up and threw the weight as high as we could and all that stuff. So I had a lot of bad habits to correct. But I invested that time. It's like money. I invested the time that I had spent doing that, and I put it into honing in and deliberate practice with the actual movement. And I saw 100% more return on that investment. So that's been the biggest evolution. And now people ask me I don't prescribe any of that stuff, all the extra stuff. I don't, because I don't think that it's needed. But I also understand that it still kind of feels nice to foam roll and these types of things. And so I just tell people to do it on your own time. And I'm not here to flip your world upside down, but if your goal is this, then we need to do these things. And that can just be like cherry on top instead of the inverse.
Nice. That's good. All right. Well, we can get to this final fourth question, unless you have someone that you felt like popped into your head that you would sit down and interview.
Well, I was thinking, so of the research, the acute to chronic workload ratio research, there's a guy named Tim Gabbett, who's a researcher who's kind of like, you'll see his name on most of those research papers, but I actually interviewed him a month ago. So that would have been the guy. But yeah, I interviewed him. Then I was thinking, what about in weightlifting? I think named Sulaimanoglu, Little Pocket Hercules. I think, in my opinion, the best weightlifter of all time. He died, I think he died last year. I can't remember. Last year or the year before, sometime recently. But he was in some of the best battles in weightlifting. The 96 Olympics, his back and forth battle was amazing. He trained in the Bulgarian system. for a time. And so his experience just in that era, in the 80s and 90s, in those countries where it was like literally do or die to some extent, like perform, or your family doesn't eat, these types of things. I would just love to sit him down and just listen to stories of that type of training, like good and bad, that type of thing. And also, he actually had trouble. I think that he had some later in his career or later in his life after weightlifting had some issues with substance abuse and these types of things. So like there was something in there, something going on there. And like I would have liked to sit him down and just hear all about it, I guess. So I feel like the best of any sport has there has to be something dark in there to drive you to that. It's like Michael Jordan is like, okay, best basketball player ever lived. He was also pathologically competitive. Like there's stories on Jordan of just how if you beat him in a game of pool, he hated you and he would play pool until he could beat you. And like these types of things that stuff fascinates me. Like what makes the great people great? That's like almost a pathological drive for one particular thing. And I love weightlifting. So it's kind of a no-brainer for me to pick the best weightlifter.
Nice. That's good. I know Michael Jordan had a serious gambling problem after retirement. It's probably because he's like, man, I can fucking beat this.
Yeah, you don't want to get competitive with casinos or poker machines.
He still kind of does, but he's got so much money. Like he would, like golf games, he would bet like $100,000 on a round, stuff like that. I mean, gambling seems like the perfect addiction for somebody who's pathologically competitive. It's nonstop, win or lose. So like you get all that money, it's like, holy shit.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, right? So that's Michael Jordan these days. So Quinn, final question, is there a book and then sort of part B to that, is there a quote that you would leave people with?
A quote. Does that have to be my quote? Somebody else's quote?
Any quote? Yeah. I mean, it could be Aristotle, Einstein, Arnold Schwarzenegger, all the common quotes.
Okay. So books, first of all, I'm going to say books are biased. I have a book, by the way. Oh, I have a book. Read my book. I'll go buy my book. Movement Assessment and Optimization for Weightlifting. There you go. But books are biased. I read books all the time, but I also know I take them with a grain of salt because it's the lens of whoever's writing it, right? So
of course,
with books, they're great. Also read research. Just because you're not a researcher or you think you don't have that background, you can still dive into the evidence and maybe even find somebody who's maybe more adept at reading that stuff and shoot articles to them. Research are where we're getting our ideas. So I just want to throw that out there. But as far as training, there's two books that I always recommend from RP and Juggernaut. And I get 0 from that. I just love these books and I recommend them all the time. The first one is Scientific Principles of Strength Training. So it's essentially teaching you. Yeah, it's you won't get a program in that book. That book will teach you how to write your own program, and it'll teach you all the metrics that we talked about: the tonnage, absolute volume, average intensity, maximum recoverable volume, all these things that govern your training progression. This book explains those things and it gives you the blueprint essentially to build your own sustainable program. And then they just came out with another book, basically because of all of the questions that they were getting from that Scientific Principles of Strength Training, called How Much Should I Train? That's the title of the book. And it's literally talking about what we've talked about: progression over time, maximum recoverable volume, minimum effective volume. So it's that kind of like continuum of minimum effective dose and as much as you could possibly do. How to find each of those poles, those anchors, and then a middle ground within them. And I mean, with those two books right there, you should have the ability to write your own or your clients' programs. You should have a starting point to write sustainable programs over time. And then, time and honing in your skill of writing programs will help. But I would definitely recommend those two books for anybody. They're not like Russian texts where it's just like almost literally a different language. You're not reading super training where it's just this 1,000-page reference book. They're very easy to read and down to earth, but also very, very scientific.
Nice.
Yeah. And a quote, I have lots of quotes. I save quotes all the time. I'm going to read this one. Oh, here we go. Yes. So this was a quote in a book called The Intellectual Life. And the quote was, it was kind of like a little anecdote. And it was Biot. It was a guy named Biot, who's a French physicist, and a colleague. So the colleague asked him, or he said, I'm going to ask you an interesting question. And then Biot says, it's no use. If your question is interesting, I do not know the answer. And so that's the quote. And this was a French physicist. So this is a guy who's seemingly got all the knowledge. But we talk about the old adage of the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. And I think that's 100% true. And I can attest to that as well. I'm 5 years out. Like, I'm a baby in regards to my career. I'm only 5 years out. But every year that goes by, I'm more humbled by what I don't know. And things, my approaches and clinical practice gets more simplified because I start trimming the fat on things that, like, what I'm doing this, but I don't actually know why I'm doing this. And I don't have a good explanation for this. And I'm just not going to recommend that anymore until I do, that type of thing. So you've got here a physicist saying, if your question is interesting, I don't know the answer. Now, that's not to say that we can't strive. We're all striving to get closer to the truth, but just be wary of people who claim to have all of the answers, who have never said, I don't know. And always have kind of a black and white, like they make things into dichotomies. Like, that's good and bad. Yes, no, this is what you should do. The top 3 exercises for this, like all these things that kind of make divides in the sand. Just be wary of that stuff.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I mean, that's how we feel over the podcast. It's like when we first started, probably could have told you the perfect program to get your squat strong.
Mm.
And now it's like 4.5 years later, we don't know anything. It's like, well, it depends. That's the answer to everything. So it's funny how
as it should be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just which makes it interesting, right? Which is why it's always a journey, and there's always more great minds like yourself to interview. So I think that's probably a really good place to leave it. So anyone listening, probably I reckon the best place to find out more about Dr. Quinn is Quinn with N Henoch, HENOCHDPT. That's your Instagram handle. Easy one to remember. And so from there, they can find your Clinical Athlete, and which is a lot easier at Clinical Athlete as well. They can find your stuff there. But is there anywhere else you want to send people? Your book you mentioned as well, website?
Yeah, the Catalyst Athletics is the publisher of the book, but the book is on Amazon. So if you just go on Amazon and put in Quinn Henoch, that'll pop right up. But the name of the book is Movement Assessment and Optimization for Weightlifters. So it's basically exactly what all the things we've talked about, like honing in your positions for the snatch and clean and jerk in a book form.
Nice.
So that's out there. And Clinical Athlete is a directory of healthcare providers so athletes can find somebody that they trust, and providers can get athletes in their area. And we also have a forum for healthcare professionals, strength and conditioning coaches, and students of both fields, where we share resources and webinars and online courses and discussions and research articles and all the good stuff. So the directory and forum, that's all at clinicalathlete.com. And then, like you said, we have our Instagram and Facebook and all that good stuff.
Do you have people in Australia?
We have, off and on, we've had, over the last 3 years, we've had people in Australia, then we've not, like they've either changed careers or they changed clinics and they had it. So I think currently we only have people in the forum from Australia. Definitely in 100% open to getting clinicians on the map in Australia, for sure. I think we've got a good following out there. I'm just looking for the right peeps. There's a screening process, so they have to apply and they have to discuss things in the forum. We actually make people talk to each other and discuss ideas. You're not just a dot on the map. You have to actually care about what you're doing. So
yeah, no, that's good. I mean, there's a ton of people listening to this that I think you should definitely apply for that sort of thing.
Prove that their knees don't go too far out to get in.
That's right.
yeah. They have to show a picture of their squat. That's part of the screening process.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Quinn. Well, from both of us, it's been awesome. It's finally good to have someone whose stuff we've been following for such a long time on the podcast and share your information. So it's been great, and hopefully we can see you, for round 2. But more importantly, back on the offline show with CrossFit, battling some false principles about training. So, it was an honor. Thanks so much for being on.
Thanks, guys. I loved it. Had a good time.
Awesome. Thanks.